Winter had settled over the kingdom, quiet and absolute. Snow covered the castle roofs, hung from the trees, and filled the air with a soft, endless drift that swallowed every sound. Inside those heavy walls, the queen sat alone by a window carved from black wood. She worked her needle through pale fabric, sewing in silence, her thoughts as cold and still as the garden below. When her needle slipped, a drop of blood fell onto the snow piled against the sill. The red was so bright, so alive, that it startled her. She looked at it for a long time and whispered a wish that seemed to rise from somewhere deeper than her own heart. "If only I had a child," she said softly, "with skin as white as this snow, lips as red as this blood, and hair as black as this window frame." It was a small wish, the kind that vanishes into the air and is forgotten. But in this castle, words carried weight. The wish took root, unseen and unstoppable. Months passed. The snow melted, flowers returned, and the queen's belly began to grow. She smiled again for the first time in years, though she never spoke of her strange winter wish. When the child was born, the midwives gasped. The baby's skin was pale as snow, her lips deep red, her hair black as polished ebony. The queen named her Snow White. For one brief moment, the world felt perfect. The queen held her daughter close and believed she had been granted a miracle. But some miracles are simply trades the world makes in secret. Before the moon had turned twice, the queen's breath grew shallow. She held the child's tiny hand, whispered a last blessing, and was gone. The king buried his wife beneath the castle chapel, and all the kingdom mourned. But grief has a short reign in royal halls. Within a year, the king remarried, a woman of striking beauty and sharp intelligence. She carried herself like someone who believed she was meant to be admired. Her eyes lingered too long on mirrors. Her words always came back to beauty, to perfection, to the hunger of being the fairest in every room. Snow White grew, her mother's features softening into something brighter and purer. Servants whispered that the girl glowed like morning light, and those whispers reached the new queen's ears. Each compliment to the child felt like a stone dropped into her calm surface. Yet she smiled, patient and pleasant, until she could retreat to her private chamber, a room lined with silk and silence, and at its centre, a mirror framed in gold. This was no ordinary mirror. It did not merely reflect, it answered. And when the queen stood before it, the air seemed to tighten around her. She asked the same question each day, her voice low and careful, like a prayer. "Mirror, mirror upon the wall, who is the fairest one of all?" And each day the mirror replied, "You are, my queen. You are the fairest of them all." The words pleased her, soothed her, became part of her heartbeat. But words have a way of changing, just as wishes do. And when they change, the world around them begins to darken. Years slipped quietly through the castle halls. Snow White grew from a small, curious child into a young woman with the calm grace of her late mother. Her skin stayed pale, her eyes bright, her laughter soft and genuine, the kind that warmed even the servants who lived their lives in whispers. The queen watched her closely. At first, it was only curiosity, but curiosity has a way of changing shape. She noticed how people turned toward the girl when she entered a room, how they smiled a little longer, how her innocence seemed to make the world itself behave more kindly. The queen began to measure herself against her stepdaughter, not in years or wisdom, but in beauty. Each morning, she stood before her mirror, the one framed in gold, carved with symbols no one in the castle could name. Its surface was smooth as still water, yet something lived behind it, something that listened, Her question was always the same. Mirror, mirror upon the wall, who is the fairest one of all? And the mirror, with its cold and perfect honesty, replied, You are, my queen. You are the fairest of them all. The queen would smile, that small, sharp smile that never quite reached her eyes, and the day would begin. But beauty, even when praised, is fragile. It demands to be confirmed again and again, and every repetition weakens the truth it tries to hold. Then, one morning, the mirror's voice changed. The air in the chamber grew still, and when the queen asked her question, the mirror answered, You are fair, my queen. It is true, but Snow White is 1,000 times fairer than you. The words struck like a blade drawn too quickly. The queen stared at her reflection, waiting for it to correct itself, but the mirror only shimmered faintly, offering no comfort. In that instant, the admiration she had enjoyed all her life turned sour. Every compliment she had ever received sounded hollow. The name Snow White echoed inside her skull until it became unbearable. She tried to reason with herself. Snow White was young. She was her stepdaughter. There was no threat. But the mirror's words wouldn't fade. They repeated in her mind, quiet but merciless. Snow White is fairer than you. Days passed, and the queen's temper grew sharp enough to wound anyone near her. Servants moved in silence. The king, tired of her coldness, buried himself in affairs of state, leaving the castle in her hands. And Snow White, innocent to the envy surrounding her, continued to grow lovelier, unaware that each smile she gave chipped away at her stepmother's sanity. One evening, the queen dismissed all her attendants and stood before the mirror again. The room was lit by a single candle. Its reflection trembled across the glass. She whispered, Tell me again, mirror, who is the fairest one of all? The answer did not change. You are fair, my queen. It is true, but Snow White is 1,000 times fairer than you. Her breath caught. Her hands trembled against the table. Something broke inside her. Quiet, final, like glass under pressure. From that moment, love turned to hatred. Beauty no longer mattered if it could not be the greatest. And in the dark corners of her mind, the queen began to imagine how peace might return. Not through grace or kindness, but through removal. By dawn, she had made her decision. If Snow White lived, the mirror would never again call her the fairest. And that, to the queen, was a truth she could not bear. The queen waited until the morning light had barely touched the snow outside her chamber. Her servants had learned not to question her silence, but today there was purpose in every movement. She called for her most trusted huntsman, a man known more for obedience than courage, one who understood that a royal command was not to be weighed against conscience. He arrived quickly, still dusted with frost from the courtyard. He bowed deeply, waiting for orders he already sensed would not bring him pride. The queen stood before him in a gown the colour of mourning and said, without hesitation, Take the princess into the forest, far away, where no one will find you. Kill her there. Bring me her lungs and liver as proof. The words hung in the air like smoke. The huntsman didn't speak, didn't question. He only nodded, but his eyes, when he looked at her, were filled with something uncertain, not fear, not loyalty, but unease. Later that day, he found Snow White in the courtyard, feeding crumbs to the birds. She turned to him with the same warmth she offered everyone. When he told her the queen wished to see her in the woods, she smiled, unaware of what waited beyond the trees. The forest was old, the kind that keeps its own secrets. Sunlight broke through in thin, trembling lines, and the air smelled of pine and damp earth. Snow White followed the huntsman without suspicion, her basket swinging lightly at her side. She spoke about the birds, the stillness, the quiet beauty of the morning. The huntsman said nothing. Each word she spoke tightened the weight in his chest. When they reached a clearing deep within the woods, the huntsman stopped. His grip tightened around the handle of his knife. Snow White turned to him, her smile fading when she saw the tremor in his hands. "My lady," he said, voice rough with something close to guilt, "forgive me." She frowned, stepping back. "Forgive you? For what?" "The Queen," he said, barely managing the words. "She has commanded me to end your life." For a moment, neither of them moved. The forest seemed to hold its breath. Then, when Snow White's eyes widened with fear, something human broke through the hardness in the man's face. He threw the knife to the ground and stepped back. "Run," he said. "Run as far as you can. Never return to the castle. If you stay, she will not rest until you're dead." Snow White hesitated only a heartbeat before she turned and fled, disappearing into the trees. The forest swallowed her quickly, her dark hair, her pale dress, the faint sound of her breath fading into the cold. The huntsman stood alone in the clearing, listening to the wind shift through the branches. Then he knelt, clutching his head, as if the silence itself accused him. To protect himself, he killed a wild boar nearby, its cry echoing once through the woods. When the body fell still, he cut out its lungs and liver, wrapped them in cloth, and carried them back to the castle. The Queen waited in her private chamber. When he presented the bundle, she took it without a word. Her eyes gleamed with satisfaction, and her mouth curled into a faint, dangerous smile. That night, she dined well. The cook prepared the meat in rich wine and herbs, unaware of what it was meant to be. The Queen ate each bite slowly, savouring it as though consuming victory itself. But somewhere deep in the forest, Snow White was still alive, alone, frightened, and lost among the shadows of trees that whispered warnings to no one. And while the Queen slept soundly, her mirror, that cruel, honest mirror, waited in silence, ready to speak again when she next dared to ask. Snow White ran until her legs gave out beneath her. The forest was endless. Every tree looked the same. Every shadow seemed to move. The sun vanished behind heavy branches, and soon she was surrounded by cold, by silence, and by eyes that belonged to no one she could see. She stumbled through thorn and root, her dress torn, her breath sharp in her throat. When she finally fell, she stayed down for a long time, pressing her hands against the damp earth. The quiet of the forest was not peaceful. It was watchful, ancient, almost alive. Then, through the trees, she saw a flicker of light. It pulsed softly, not the gold of the sun, but the warm glow of fire. She pushed herself to her feet and followed it. Each step brought her closer to the faint sound of a chimney breathing smoke into the cold night. At last, she came upon a small house built beneath the curve of a hill. The door was low, the windows narrow, and the roof looked as if it were made from the forest itself. Everything about it seemed too small for the world it lived in. But it was warm, and the air smelled faintly of bread and ash. Snow White hesitated at the threshold, listening. There was no sound inside. She knocked softly once, then again. When no one answered, she pushed the door open. Inside, the house was clean and perfectly arranged. A small wooden table sat in the center, set for 7 with tiny plates, tiny spoons, and cups no bigger than her hands. Along the far wall stood 7 little chairs, and above them 7 neatly made beds lined in a row. The sight made her smile for the first time since she'd fled the castle. Hunger eventually pulled her from her thoughts. On the table sat bread, stew, and small cups of wine. She took a bite of each, careful not to empty any one plate. Then, exhausted, she climbed the stairs and lay across the seventh bed, which fit her only just enough. Within moments, she fell into a deep, dreamless sleep. Hours passed. The forest outside darkened completely, and from a hidden path came 7 shadows carrying lanterns. They were miners, small, sturdy men with the rough hands of those who spend their lives beneath the ground. They entered the cottage talking quietly until they saw what had changed. "Someone's been here," said one, pointing to the table. "The bread's been broken." "The wine's been touched," said another. "And someone's lying in my bed," said the youngest, peering up the staircase. They climbed the steps one by one and gathered around her. In the dim light, her skin seemed to glow. She looked less like an intruder and more like a fallen angel that had lost its way. They spoke in hushed voices, unsure what to do. At last, one said, "Let her sleep. Whoever she is, the forest brought her here for a reason." Morning came, and when Snow White awoke, she found 7 pairs of eyes staring at her, not unkindly, but with curiosity and caution. She sat up quickly, murmuring an apology, but the eldest among them raised a hand. "Tell us your name and how you came to this place," he said. She told them everything: the jealous queen, the huntsman's mercy, her desperate escape through the woods. When she finished, there was silence. The men exchanged looks, understanding more than they said. "You may stay here," the eldest told her at last, "if you will keep our home in order, cook, clean, mend our clothes, and wait for us when we return from the mines. In return, no harm will come to you." Snow White agreed, grateful for their kindness. From that day on, she lived among them, learning their routines, the sound of their boots, the songs they sang as they marched to work, the faint hum of pickaxes deep in the mountains. For the first time since her mother's death, she felt safe. But safety is fragile, and envy never sleeps for long. Far away, in her high chamber, the queen stood once more before her mirror, ready to ask her question, unaware that the forest had not finished writing Snow White's story. Days passed quietly in the dwarf's cottage. Snow White tended the fire, mended the beds, and prepared warm meals that filled the little home with the smell of bread and herbs. The dwarfs came and went at dawn and dusk, covered in dust from the mines, always smiling when they saw her waiting at the door. In the evenings, they spoke around the hearth. They told her of the mountains and the deep tunnels beneath them, where the rocks glittered like stars caught in stone. Snow White listened and laughed, though a shadow still lingered behind her eyes, a memory of the castle, of the huntsman's trembling voice, and of the woman who once called herself her mother. Back in that castle, the queen's patience had run dry. The days since Snow White's disappearance had been peaceful, and she had convinced herself that the girl was gone for good. When she finally returned to her mirror, she did so with a confident smile. "Mirror, mirror upon the wall," she said, her voice smooth and controlled, "who is the fairest one of all?" The mirror's surface rippled once, like disturbed water, before it spoke. "You are fair, my queen. It is true. But Snow White, who lives with the 7 little men in the mountains, is 1,000 times fairer than you." The queen froze. The sound of that name was unbearable, soft, innocent, unbroken by death. The mirror did not lie. It never did. Her reflection stared back at her, a beautiful face twisted in disbelief, her hands clenched against the table, and her calm shattered like glass under a hammer. "She lives," she whispered. That child still lives. Her fury burned white hot, but her cruelty was colder, more deliberate. She knew she couldn't send another to finish what had been left undone. If Snow White had survived once, she might survive again. So the Queen made her decision. She would go herself. From her cabinets, she drew powders, dyes, and cloth. Hours later, the face in the mirror no longer belonged to a queen. It was the face of an old peddler woman, wrinkled and harmless. She packed a basket with ribbons and laces, each threaded with dark magic, and set off toward the mountains. When she reached the cottage, Snow White was alone, the dwarfs having gone to work. The girl saw the woman's bent figure through the window and felt no fear. "Good day, my dear," said the disguised queen, her voice rough and kind. "I'm selling the finest laces, soft as silk and strong as truth. Would you care to see?" Snow White hesitated. The dwarfs had warned her never to open the door for strangers, but the woman's smile seemed gentle, and the laces shimmered in the sunlight. "I can't let anyone in," Snow White said through the window. "Then don't," the woman replied sweetly. "But surely there's no harm in trying one lace. Here, let me help you from where you stand." It was such a small kindness, such an ordinary offer, that Snow White's caution faltered. She turned around, lifting her hair so the woman could wrap the lace around her waist. The Queen's fingers moved quickly, pulling the string tighter and tighter until Snow White gasped for air. The girl's hands clawed weakly at her chest, her breath fading as her vision darkened. The world tilted. The Queen stepped back and watched with cold satisfaction as Snow White fell lifeless to the floor. "There," she whispered. "Now I am the fairest once more." She left the cottage and vanished into the woods, her laughter low and cruel. When the dwarfs returned that evening, the house was too quiet. They found Snow White lying still on the floor, her face pale and her lips blue. They searched desperately until they saw the lace drawn tight around her. With shaking hands, they cut it loose. Air rushed into her lungs. Snow White gasped, eyes wide with confusion. The dwarfs gathered around her in relief and fear. When she could finally speak, she told them of the old woman. The eldest dwarf's voice was stern but kind. "That was no peddler, child. That was your stepmother. You must not open the door again. For anyone." Snow White promised. She meant every word. But somewhere beyond the trees, the Queen was already on her way home, confident that her hands had finished what the huntsman could not. And soon she would ask her mirror again. For 2 days, the Queen lived in peace. She walked the halls of the castle with quiet pride, her steps lighter, her heart steady. When she caught her reflection in the tall mirrors, she smiled again, a genuine, satisfied smile she hadn't worn in years. By the 3rd morning, she stood before her mirror and asked the question that had defined her life. "Mirror, mirror upon the wall, who is the fairest one of all?" The mirror shimmered like water before freezing into silence. Then, in a voice as calm as ever, it said, "You are fair, my queen. It is true. But Snow White, who lives with the 7 little men in the mountains, is 1,000 times fairer than you." The words landed like stones dropped into ice water. The Queen's hands trembled. Her throat went dry. For a long time she said nothing, only stared at her reflection as if it had betrayed her. Then quietly, her rage returned. "She still lives," she whispered. "That girl is protected by luck, but luck runs out." This time her plan would be perfect. No hesitation, no mistake. She went back to her secret chamber, where bottles of poison and strange ingredients filled the shelves. Herbs that could steal breath, powders that could slow a heart, oils that shimmered with hidden venom. She mixed them carefully until the air itself grew heavy with their scent. When she was done, she dipped a small wooden comb into the dark liquid. Its teeth soaked in the poison until they glistened faintly. It looked harmless, even beautiful. A comb meant for a queen. Hours later, she stood before the mirror again, transforming herself into another disguise, a traveling merchant, bent and tired, with kind eyes and a gentle smile. She covered her fine clothes with rags and set off once more toward the mountains. The path was long, and the forest older than she remembered. Snow White's cottage appeared at the edge of a clearing, its small windows glowing faintly in the afternoon light. Inside, Snow White was sweeping the floor and humming softly to herself. The dwarfs had left for the mines, but their warning still echoed in her mind. She froze when she heard the knock at the door. "Who is it?" she called. "Only a poor woman," came the soft reply. "Selling combs and ribbons. Please, child, spare a moment for an old traveller." Snow White hesitated. "I cannot open the door," she said through the wood. "Then at least look," said the voice. "They are beautiful things, made to bring good fortune." Against her better judgment, Snow White stepped to the window. The woman held up a comb carved from dark wood, polished and gleaming. "You see? Such beauty should rest in hair like yours." Snow White blushed slightly. "I cannot buy anything today," she said, starting to turn away. But the woman smiled kindly. "Oh, child, take it as a gift. You have brought me more joy with your smile than any coin could." Snow White hesitated again, then slowly opened the window just enough to accept the gift. "Thank you," she said softly. "Here," the woman said. "Let me place it for you. It will sit perfectly." Snow White leaned forward slightly, trusting. The comb touched her scalp. In that instant, the poison sank through her skin. Her smile faded. Her fingers loosened on the window frame. Without a sound, she collapsed where she stood. The queen stepped back, watching. "So ends your beauty," she whispered. She turned and disappeared into the forest, her laughter carried away by the wind. That evening, the dwarfs returned. Again, the cottage was silent. They found Snow White lying motionless, her head turned to the side, the comb still tangled in her dark hair. The eldest knelt beside her and saw the faint shimmer of poison along the teeth. Carefully, he removed it, and almost at once, colour returned to her face. She drew in a sharp breath and blinked at them, confused. "It was the old woman again," she said weakly. The dwarfs looked at each other, fear in their eyes now, not surprise. "You must not open the door," the eldest said firmly. "Not for anyone. The queen will not stop." Snow White nodded, tears in her eyes. She understood now that this was not a nightmare that could simply end with mourning. Evil was patient, and it wore many faces. Far away, the queen stood once more before her mirror, her disguise shed, her heart steady. She asked her question a final time that night, expecting the truth she had earned. But the mirror's voice returned as before, unbroken and cruel. "You are fair, my queen. It is true. But Snow White, who lives with the 7 little men in the mountains, is 1,000 times fairer than you." The queen's smile faded. The room grew cold. "Then I will finish this," she whispered, "even if it costs me everything." The queen no longer slept. She wandered her chambers in silence, her thoughts circling the same dark truth. Twice she had tried to kill Snow White, and twice the girl had escaped her. Each failure deepened the queen's hatred until it no longer felt like anger, but something colder and permanent. When the first light of dawn reached her room, she stood before the mirror once more. Her reflection looked fragile now, almost transparent beneath her flawless skin. But the voice that answered her still carried the same cruel certainty. "You are fair, my queen. It is true. But Snow White, who lives with the 7 little men in the mountains, is 1,000 times fairer than you." For a moment, she didn't move. Then, slowly, a smile crept across her face. Not soft or bitter this time, but something far more dangerous. "So be it," she whispered. "If the girl is protected by life, then I will give her death that even life cannot undo." In the dark of her secret chamber, she lit the lamps and took out her most guarded poisons, those whispered to have been born from the roots of cursed trees and the breath of sleeping serpents. She mixed them carefully, her hands steady, her eyes hollow. When she was done, she held a single apple in her palm, half red, half pale. One side was harmless, sweet as honey. The other was death itself, its poison resting just beneath the skin. By the time she left the castle, she was no longer a queen. Her disguise was perfect. An old peasant woman in worn rags, her hair grey and wild, her hands trembling just enough to draw sympathy. The basket on her arm was filled with apples, each shining, but only one cursed. The path to the mountains felt longer than before. Wind whispered through the trees, almost as if it warned her to turn back. But she pressed on. There was nothing left in her heart but purpose. At the dwarf's cottage, Snow White was sweeping the floor when she heard the knock. She hesitated, remembering the voices of her protectors. "Who's there?" she asked through the door. "Just a poor woman," said the voice outside, soft and cracked with age. "Selling fresh apples to buy my supper." Snow White shook her head. "I can't let anyone in. You must go." "Oh, child," the woman said with a tired laugh. "What harm could come from a single apple? Look at them. See how lovely they are. Here, take one. I'll cut it in half so you can see it's safe." Snow White hesitated, peeking through the small window. The apple gleamed red and perfect in the woman's hand. "You'll eat some first?" she asked. "Of course, my dear." The old woman sliced the fruit cleanly in two. She took a bite from the pale side and chewed slowly, smiling. "There, you see? Perfectly harmless." Snow White smiled faintly, reassured. She reached through the window and took the red half. "Thank you," she said softly. She lifted it to her lips, and the moment her teeth broke the skin, the poison rushed through her like a whisper. The apple slipped from her hand, rolling across the floor. Her eyes widened for an instant, then her body crumpled soundlessly. The queen stood outside the window, watching. The faintest smile crossed her face as she whispered, "Rest now, little Snow White. You'll trouble me no more." Then she turned and vanished into the forest. When the dwarfs returned that evening, they knew before entering that something was wrong. The air inside the cottage felt heavy and still. Snow White lay on the floor, her lips red but her skin pale as wax. They searched for lace, for comb, for any sign of trickery, but found nothing. Her pulse was gone. Her chest did not rise. They wept. Not loudly, but in the quiet way of men who have already known loss. They tried everything, water, breath, prayer, but nothing could wake her. "She looks alive," whispered one, his voice breaking. "She doesn't fade." The eldest shook his head. "She's gone," he said softly, "but her body rejects death. The forest will not take her." And so they did not bury her. Instead, they built a coffin of glass and gold, so her beauty would never vanish, even in stillness. They placed her within it, beneath the open sky, where sunlight could fall upon her face and snow could rest gently at her feet. They took turns keeping watch. Days became weeks. Seasons shifted, yet Snow White remained untouched, frozen between life and death. Lips still red, hair still black, skin still white as snow. Far away, the queen once again stood before her mirror. "Mirror, mirror upon the wall," she said, her voice almost trembling. "Who is the fairest one of all?" The mirror glowed faintly before answering. "You, my queen. You are the fairest of them all." The queen exhaled, her smile returning at last. For the first time in years, the mirror had spoken the words she longed to hear. She believed it was over. But in the forest, beneath the quiet snow, Snow White's story was not yet done. Winter returned, before the dwarfs accepted what they could not change. Each morning they visited the glade where Snow White rested, brushing snow from the glass, speaking softly as if she could still hear them. The forest grew around her, quiet and respectful. Even the animals kept their distance, watching from the shadows. They had built the coffin carefully, thick glass sealed with gold, the joints tight as a prayer. Beneath her head, they placed a white pillow embroidered with her name. Across her chest, they laid a single white lily that never seemed to wilt. Snow White looked untouched by death. Her cheeks still held a trace of colour, and her lips remained as red as the day she fell. The dwarfs didn't understand it. She didn't decay. She didn't age. She simply slept. At first they hoped she might wake, that some strange miracle had preserved her for a reason. But time taught them otherwise. Days turned to months, months to years, and though grief softened, it never left them. They could not bear to bury her, nor could they leave her alone. So they built a shelter over the glade, a small roof supported by wooden beams to keep the snow from her face. Sometimes travellers passed through the mountains and glimpsed her resting there, a pale girl in a glass coffin, watched over by 7 small men. Some said she was a saint. Others whispered she was cursed. The dwarfs said nothing. They only guarded her, the same way they guarded the secrets of the earth. In the evenings, they sat around their fire, their songs quieter now. "She doesn't belong to us anymore," one said once. The eldest nodded. "No," he said, "but we belong to her." And so the years went on. The forest grew wilder, the paths harder to follow. Yet the glade remained unchanged. It was as if time had been frightened into stillness there. Far away in the castle, the queen's life continued untouched by guilt. She stood each day before her mirror, asking her question, and each time it answered her the same way. "You, my queen, are the fairest of them all." The words had lost their sweetness, though she couldn't admit it. The victory had turned hollow. There were no rivals left, yet the joy she'd expected never came. Her reflection still pleased her eyes, but not her heart. Beauty, she was learning, could not fill the space envy had carved out. One morning, as the snow melted and the air warmed, a prince from a distant kingdom rode through the forest. He was hunting with his men, chasing a lost stag through the thick trees, when he saw a glimmer of gold among the pines. Curious, he followed it until he stepped into the clearing. There, beneath the roof of weathered wood, he saw the coffin and the girl inside it. He stopped. His men said nothing. Snow White's face lay still and peaceful, framed by her dark hair. The prince had seen portraits, sculptures, painted saints, but never a face like this. She looked neither alive nor dead, but caught between the two, as if waiting for something. He approached slowly, afraid to disturb the air around her. On the golden frame, he read the inscription carved by the dwarfs. "Snow White, the king's daughter." "She's beautiful," he whispered. "Too beautiful for the ground." When the dwarfs returned from the mines that evening, they found him there, a stranger standing over the coffin, hat in hand, eyes full of sorrow. "I beg your pardon," the prince said quietly. "Who is she?" They told him the story. The queen's envy, the huntsman's mercy, the 3 attempts, the poisoned apple, and the years that had passed since. When they finished, he bowed his head. "Allow me to take her," he said at last. "I will build a place for her where the world can honor her beauty forever. I swear she will be safe." The dwarfs hesitated. They had kept her for so long that letting her go felt like losing her all over again. But they saw truth in his face, not greed, not hunger, but grief for something pure that should not have been broken. After a long silence, the eldest nodded. "Take her," he said softly. "We've guarded her long enough." The prince thanked them and ordered his men to lift the coffin carefully. They carried it down the mountain path, the glass glinting with the last light of day. And though none of them knew it yet, each step brought Snow White closer to waking, and the queen closer to her end. The path down the mountain was steep and uneven. The prince's men moved carefully, balancing the glass coffin between them, their boots sinking into soft earth. The forest watched in silence as they passed. The branches swayed, and a cold wind followed behind, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Snow White's body shimmered faintly in the dim light, untouched by time. Her hands were folded across her chest, her expression calm, her lips still red as though she were merely resting. The men said nothing as they carried her. The sight of her seemed to demand reverence. They walked for hours until the ground leveled. As they crossed a narrow ridge, one of the men stumbled on a root hidden beneath the leaves. The coffin lurched forward, just slightly, but enough to send a dull sound echoing through the woods. Inside, something shifted. The small piece of apple, lodged deep in Snow White's throat, was dislodged by the sudden jolt. She gasped once, faintly, as air rushed into her lungs for the first time in years. The men froze. The prince turned sharply, his eyes wide. Then, before anyone could speak, Snow White opened her eyes. Her first breath was a tremor, a confused, startled sound that didn't yet understand it belonged to the living. She blinked against the light, her gaze unfocused at first, then sharp. Her voice came weakly, barely more than a whisper. Where am I?" The prince stepped closer, unable to speak for a moment. "You are safe," he said softly. "You were asleep for a very long time." Snow White sat up slowly, touching the glass walls that had surrounded her. The world outside looked strange, brighter, larger, full of colours she hadn't seen since before the apple. She pressed a hand to her chest, feeling her heartbeat, steady and fragile. "I remember. A woman," she murmured. "An old woman with an apple." The prince nodded. "She is gone now," he said. "Her evil cannot reach you any more." Snow White's eyes filled with quiet disbelief. "How long have I slept?" The prince hesitated. "Long enough for the seasons to forget your name," he said, "but not long enough for you to be forgotten." She looked at him, at the sorrow in his voice, at the warmth in his eyes. And for the first time, she smiled. It was faint, unsure, but alive. He reached out a hand. "Come with me," he said gently. "Let me bring you home. You deserve a life beyond this forest." Snow White hesitated. "I have no home left," she said softly. "The one I knew was filled with mirrors and lies." "Then make a new one," he replied, "with me." For a long time, she said nothing. Then she placed her hand in his. The gesture was simple, but in that moment, The story that had kept her trapped in silence began to change. The prince helped her from the coffin. She stood unsteady at first, the ground cold beneath her feet, the air sharp in her lungs. The dwarfs watched from the edge of the trees. They had followed at a distance, unwilling to leave her completely. When they saw her standing, they bowed their heads, smiling through tears they didn't bother to hide. Snow White thanked them quietly. "You gave me a life when I had none," she said. "I won't forget you." They said nothing in return. They didn't need to. They only watched as she and the prince walked down the forest path together, the glass coffin left behind, its empty reflection fading into shadow. By the time they reached the valley, dusk had settled. The prince's castle stood ahead, its towers lit with soft orange light. It was a warm glow, not like the cold marble halls she once knew, but a place that seemed to breathe. For the first time since childhood, Snow White felt no fear of mirrors, no chill of envy. The air was still, the night quiet, the past finally behind her. But in another kingdom, far away, a different mirror was about to speak, and its words would seal the story's end. The news of Snow White's return spread quickly. Word travelled from village to village, then across the mountains to distant towns. By the time it reached the Queen's castle, it had already twisted into something she could barely recognize. The story of a prince who had found a maiden sleeping in glass, of a love strong enough to wake the dead. But truth doesn't need to shout to wound. The Queen felt the world tilt beneath her feet when her servants spoke the name she had spent years trying to erase. "Snow White," they said. "The king's daughter has been found alive. She is to be married to a prince." For a moment, the Queen didn't move. Then she laughed, quietly, disbelief trembling in her voice. "Alive?" she whispered. "No, impossible." She walked straight to her mirror. The air around it felt heavier than ever, thick with the history of every lie it had refused to tell her. Her voice cracked as she spoke. "Mirror, mirror upon the wall, who is the fairest one of all?" The mirror shimmered, the glass rippling like disturbed water before it gave its answer. "You are fair, my queen. It is true. But the young queen, Snow White, is 1,000 times fairer than you." The sound of shattering filled the chamber before she realized she had struck the mirror. Fragments scattered across the floor, catching the light like pieces of her pride. But the reflection still stared back at her from the largest shard, her face perfect but twisted by rage. She stood in silence for a long moment. Then she whispered to herself, "A wedding, then?" When the day came, the Queen arrived uninvited. Her carriage rolled through the gates of the prince's castle like a shadow passing through sunlight. The guards did not recognize her beneath her veil, and she entered the hall unnoticed. Inside, music filled the air. Snow White stood beside the prince, dressed in white silk and gold, her face calm and radiant. The room glowed with warmth and laughter. For a moment, the Queen stood frozen, staring. The girl she had tried to destroy was alive, adored, and more beautiful than ever. Snow White's eyes met hers across the room. Recognition came slowly, but when it did, the colour drained from her face. The hall fell quiet. The prince turned to her, concerned. She whispered something to him, and a moment later the guards stepped forward. The Queen tried to retreat, but there was nowhere left to run. "Bring her forward," the prince commanded. The guests parted as the Queen was led before them, her veil torn away. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Snow White looked at her stepmother, the woman who had haunted her dreams, and saw not a monster, but a hollow thing. All the power that once filled her was gone, burned away by her own hatred. The prince spoke softly but firmly. "This woman has spilled innocent blood. Let her face the judgment she earned." At his signal, servants carried in a pair of iron shoes glowing red from the fire. The queen's eyes widened as she understood what awaited her. "No," she said, her voice trembling for the first time in years. "You cannot—" But the sentence went unfinished. The shoes were set before her, heat shimmering above them. The guards forced her forward. She screamed once as her feet touched the iron, then again, louder, as the pain seared through her. The hall watched in silence. Some turned away, others didn't. The queen stumbled and began to move, not walking, not dancing, just trying to escape the pain that had nowhere to go. Her gown caught in the light of the fire, her voice cracked, and her body fell before the song ended. When the guards carried her away, Snow White closed her eyes. There was no triumph in her expression, no victory, only quiet. The music resumed slowly, uncertainly. Life crept back into the room, but something of that silence stayed behind, a reminder of what envy had cost. That night, when the feast was over and the guests had gone, Snow White stood by her window, looking out over the dark forest. The stars above were cold and still, the same ones that had watched her grow, run, and die. She didn't think of the queen. She thought of the huntsman who had spared her, the dwarfs who had saved her, the years she had lost to someone else's hatred. And when she turned from the window, her reflection in the glass didn't frighten her anymore. Days after the wedding, the castle grew still again. The feasts were over, the music gone. What remained was peace, the kind that feels unfamiliar at first, like silence after a long storm. Snow White rose early each morning, walking through halls now filled with sunlight. Servants smiled when they saw her. Their voices carried warmth instead of fear. For the first time, the castle no longer felt haunted by envy or whispers. Yet some nights, when the wind pressed against the windows, she would find herself awake, standing before her reflection. Not out of vanity, but out of habit, the lingering echo of a life lived beneath another woman's gaze. Her reflection looked back gently now. No voice answered from beyond the glass, no judgment, no question waiting to be asked. Just a face, her own, framed by quiet. In a forgotten corner of her stepmother's old chamber, servants found what remained of the magic mirror. The frame was cracked, the surface fractured, its golden rim darkened by soot. They brought it to Snow White, asking what should be done. She studied it for a long moment. The shards reflected the room in pieces. The ceiling, her hand, a sliver of her eyes. All of them beautiful, none of them whole. "Let it rest," she said softly. "It has done enough harm." They covered it with linen and carried it away to be sealed in the castle vaults, where no voice could ever answer again. The years that followed passed quietly. Snow White ruled beside the prince, and though she never sought power, her calm presence brought it naturally. People spoke of her as a queen of fairness and patience, one who listened before she spoke, one whose kindness didn't falter even when tested. She never mentioned the poisoned apple or the lace, never spoke the queen's name again. Some believed she had forgotten, others thought forgiveness had simply taken its place. But in private, when she walked through the gardens at dusk, she would sometimes pause by a white rosebush that had begun to bloom on its own. She didn't know who had planted it. Perhaps the dwarves, perhaps no one at all. The petals reminded her of snow, untouched and quiet, and the scent carried her back to a window of black wood, to the story that had started with a wish. She would close her eyes and think of that first queen. Not the one who tried to kill her, but the one who had pricked her finger and wished for a child with skin white as snow, lips red as blood, and hair black as night. Somewhere inside her, Snow White still belonged to that wish. And perhaps, she thought, it was never the wish that was cursed, but what people did to keep it alive. As the seasons turned, her story slipped into legend. Travellers spoke of a queen whose heart had once been pure as winter and whose beauty had nearly destroyed her. They spoke of a girl who died and lived again, untouched by time. And far away, deep beneath the stone floors of the old castle, the mirror lay in darkness. Its surface was dull now, no longer smooth. Dust covered it like a shroud. If anyone had been there to listen closely, they might have sworn they heard a faint sound. Not a whisper, not a voice, but something smaller. It was silence. And after so many years of speaking, it was at peace.